took their 4 children to the Children's Day service at the Presbyterian Church. Sarah was a Sunday school teacher, and she had co-facilitated the event. When the event ended at 9:30 in the evening, the Moores returned home along with 2 of their children's friends, Ina and Lena Stillinger, who had permission to spend the night. That night, someone slipped in sometime after midnight, undetected. They borrowed a lamp whose chimney they removed, and they took an axe from the wood pile. They made their way from room to room, striking each of the victims with the blunt side of the axe. It seems that each victim slept through the entire attack, with the possible exception of little Lena Stillinger, age 12. The murderer covered the windows and mirrors with cloth, and then he washed his hands, prepared himself a meal, which he doesn't seem to have eaten, and then slipped out and locked the door behind him. The next day, around 7:30 in the morning, a neighbor, Mary, would notice that no one was caring for the animals, so she called Josiah's brother to investigate. When his brother broke into the house and made his way to the downstairs bedroom, he found 2 bodies covered in sheets. It was his brother and sister-in-law. When he left the house to call the marshal, they came inside and found that there was a body in every bed. The bloody axe was found sitting next to the bed of the Stillinger girls, and many of the victims had been struck between 20 and 30 times with the blunt side of the axe, and then covered with the cloth. There were a few suspects, one of whom was even brought to trial twice, but no one was ever convicted of the crime, and it remains unsolved to this day. Or does it? Rachel McCarthy James writes about axe murder. She studied creative writing and political science at Hollins University and was doing some freelance work when she was approached with a new research project by her eventual co-author and father, Bill James. He asked her to research a historic murder near Roanoke, Virginia, where she lived at the time, and see if she could find any cases that seemed related. The research journey she began would eventually uncover one of the most prolific serial killers in American history and finally provide an answer to the Villisca murders. Rachel McCarthy James is the co-author of the true crime book, The Man from the Train, the solving of a century-old serial killer mystery. It was nominated for an Edgar Award and won the Kansas Book Award. She and her husband live in Lawrence, Kansas, just a little closer to the train tracks than you would expect, given the style of her writing. And she is currently working on a solo book, Whack Job, also about axe murder, to be published by St. Martin's Press in 2013. Thank you so much for joining us, Rachel.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Our pleasure.
If you've ever worked with family, you know that it can be a complicated process from a number of angles. And the process of writing The Man from the Train was a big, constantly changing task. We looked at literally hundreds of murders over a 40-year period. But eventually we got into a good routine. I would comb through newspaper reports for crimes that looked likely, download those stories, write them into a narrative, and email them to Dad. I usually say that I did about 70% of the research and Dad did about 70% of the writing, which is why I'm okay with his name being first. Also the fact that people know who Bill James is and people didn't really know who the heck Rachel McCarthy James is. And he gave me the opportunity to write about these crimes in my own voice right at the end of the book when we reveal who the man from the train is and the crime that led us to him. Though I'm going to avoid spoilers for now and recommend that you put a hold on our book at the Des Moines Public Library. A lot of the book is not as discreet as I wrote this, Dad wrote that. There are a lot of little things that come from those emails. A reference to Alice Roosevelt's wedding, an observation about Louis Cassaway's age. But sometimes it's very clear that it's Dad's own distinct voice. I'd like to read from one of my favorite very Dad passages here. It's from chapter 42, where the evening is spread out against the sky. The people who lived in small towns 100 years ago lived lives every bit as rich and varied as your life or my life. Everything meaningful that has ever happened in your life happened just as often to people in small towns 100 years ago as it does to people in New York or LA in the 21st century. People who lived in small towns 100 years ago fell in love, fell out of love, got married, got divorced, and had affairs inside and outside of marriage. They got jobs, got promoted, and got fired. They started their own businesses, sometimes got rich, more often went bankrupt, or just gave it up and closed the doors. They formed lifetime friendships. They fell into bitter rivalries with people they could not avoid. They joined groups of people who had interests like their own. They played sports, they got fat, got determined to get back into shape, sometimes succeeded, and more often failed. They had children and they raised their children. They suffered through their children's failings. Sometimes those were terrible failings. They took vacations, they traveled far from home and brought back souvenirs. They bought a new house or, down on their luck, moved into a dumpy house and hoped to get into someplace better. They rooted for faraway sports teams. They buried their parents and buried their brothers and sisters and sometimes buried their children. They got cancer and had heart attacks and contracted diseases that they had never heard of. Most of them were honest people, but there were thieves among them and con men. And they bought new things, new toys, new inventions, and they were excited by these new things as you are by yours. They suffered through fires, floods, and other natural disasters. They drank, and some of them became alcoholics, and some of them became drug addicts. Amusements? I lived in a town of 300 people in the 1950s. If we had wanted to, we could have gone to some type of organized event 365 days a year. Football games or basketball or baseball, church picnics, church pageants, school plays, school programs, political rallies, parades, band concerts, VFW meetings, Knights of Columbus events, holiday celebrations, fundraisers, community meetings, store openings, private parties, public parties, and on average, these events were exactly as interesting as the events that you go to now. If you read about a crime in a small town, you will frequently encounter frequently the comment that these people lived in the kind of quiet place where nothing interesting ever happened. This book is almost entirely about people who lived in small towns 100 years ago, as much about how they died as how they lived. But the flash of death illuminates the lives that the victims had lived. The man from the train murdered these people, placing no value on their lives. Small town people are different from city people in some ways, and people 100 years ago were different from 21st century urban people in some ways. I'm not saying that those people were exactly like us. In many ways, our lives are better than theirs. In many ways, their lives were better than ours. Life was as busy 109 years ago as it is today, and people were as obsessed with true crime then as we were today. Crime reporting has been an essential part of the newspaper industry since its beginnings, as many early circulating publications were essentially reports from court cases. Some people would pay for 18th century papers to advertise about their crimes so they could seek justice from the public when they didn't get it from the court system. The Victorian age in particular was a time when prurient reporting ruled the day. The more lurid, the better. Newspapers were involved not just in disseminating information about crimes, but in shaping citizen attitudes towards crime and punishment, reflecting both an actual and perceived rise in crime, much like cable news or Twitter today. Stories of murder were part of what the public demanded when they sought out news, allowing a crime in a small town in the Midwest to make an impression across the country. But even though we've always had prurient taste, we have a completely different idea of what murder was, especially when it came to one of the most sensational and enduring fascinations of modern crime literature, the serial killer. One of the things I talked about on the Des Moines Public Library podcast was the fact that people in Villisca did not know what a serial killer was. They probably heard of Jack the Ripper, but the idea that there were more Jack the Rippers riding the rails, visiting their town, was unimaginable. This is part of why they clung to the idea that Frank Jones, a rival businessman whose daughter-in-law, J.B. Moore, had been suspected of having an affair with, was guilty of the crime, or the lecherous traveling preacher Lynn Kelly. They clung to their ideas of these people's guilt, not because it made logical sense, but because the crime was beyond all logical sense. Being able to hang it on something normal, anger over infidelity, or an obvious creep confirming their worst instincts about them, was an attempt to make it square with their worldview. In 1911, Morton Prince had just begun to pioneer the study of psychopathy. Like a lot of psychological thinking, it wasn't a familiar aspect of human nature for the average person in small town Iowa. The idea of the serial killer wasn't formally studied until the 1970s, as I suspect most viewers of this speech will know. And while humanity has always been brutal and murderous, some researchers believe that serial killers are a distinctly modern phenomenon related to urbanization, social stratification, and mass media. I'm quoting here from a paper by Kevin Haggerty and Ariane Ellerbrock. In pre-modern societies, individuals knew one another by name, often having intimate knowledge of their neighbor's family history, daily routine, and personal predilections. As we see with the Moore family, people knew how they took care of their animals and that they weren't likely to leave them neglected even for one day. Strangers were rarely encountered, and when encountered, the subject of rumor and suspicion. The average medieval citizen might have only met 100 strangers during the course of their life. The rise of capitalism and the related processes of mass migration to urban centers resulted in individuals being immersed in a sea of strangers. This development also proved to be key precondition for the emergence of serial murder, given that a defining attribute of serial killers is that they prey on strangers, something that distinguishes them from the vast majority of homicide, which typically involves some form of prior relationship between the killer and victim. Thus, dense, modern, urbane environments represent ideal settings for the routine, impersonal encounters that operate as a hallmark of serial killing. Now, Villisca in 1912 was not a dense urban environment. It was certainly a lot more dense than farming communities were 100 years before that, but it still was a small city. JB and Sarah Moore were probably closer to seeing 100 strangers in their lifetime, end of the spectrum, than anyone who lives in Villisca today, who has certainly been to Omaha or Des Moines. But dense urban centers like Des Moines were not that far away at all in 1912, just a quick train ride. And the rise of the city and easy travel weren't the only aspect of what gave rise to the phenomenon of the serial killer. It also comes back to newspapers. The rise of celebrity, of widespread attention for individual people, was part of the attraction for marginalized people like the man from the train. Stories like Helen Jewett or Lizzie Borden, those got a ton of play across the country, and people took notice of what other people were taking notice of. We see this today. People are desperate to get some kind of recognition, even if it's for bad reasons. We believe that the man from the train read the papers, noted whether or not his crimes were noticed, whether or not he was recognized. He liked the attention, and I hate to admit it, but he'd probably love this book. There are other aspects about murder that were changing in 1912. One of the everyday aspects of small town life that facilitated these crimes was the convenience of the axe, its presence in every woodpile. The axe is one of our first tools, an omnipresent fact of life. Anywhere wood might need to be cut. But even in 1912, they were starting to feel like a bit of an anachronism. The lumber industry was really booming at this point, which is part of what we believe the man from the train did for money. But there was a huge construction boom, which was deeply related to the trains. People were spreading out across the country, cutting wood in the Midwest. There were a lot of advances in fire technology that led to more axes being present. But they were also industrializing wood cutting a lot more than they were a few years before. It was less of an everyday thing by 1912. So even in 1912, the axes were starting to feel like a bit of an anachronism. Axes have always been used for murder, but there's a specific catchiness to the term axe murder. It's not a formula we use with other crimes linguistically. If you're murdered with a knife, it's a stabbing, usually not a knife murder. If you're murdered with a gun, it's a shooting, usually not a gun murder. But if you're murdered with an axe, it's almost always an axe murder, sometimes a slaying. The term the term axe murderer dates back to the 1870s, but it came to become a regular part of our national vocabulary because of the Villisca atrocity and the subsequent crimes. These stories got play across the country. People were aware that there was a maniac they didn't have the language of serial killer as I addressed earlier, but they were definitely aware that there was a guy who was killing people in Oregon and Colorado and Iowa and Kansas and Illinois. And because of that, they were covering, readers across the country were interested in this story, and axe murder was the term that was most often used with it. And that's part of how it became a part of our vocabulary, which increased in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. By the 1940s, it was starting to be used as kind of a humorous term. There's an old Nick and Nora movie where she refers to Sambo being possibly an axe murderer. And there's a Shirley Jackson book, a nonfiction book, where she talks about being tired of domestic life and opening up the paper to look for an axe murderer to kind of give her day a little life. And part of that, so this became a part of our national vocabulary because of Villisca. And that's partially because even by 1912, axes seemed like a weird, unwieldy, and especially personal way to kill. With the efficiency and effectiveness of the gun, why would you reach for an axe? 1912 was 20 years after the invention of the automatic firearm, and gun violence was about to rise precipitously, even though murder was about to dip overall. Guns have radically changed our relationship to murder and death on a number of levels: in war, lawmaking, interpersonal violence, etc. Villisca was a bit of an outlier in the day in that he was one person perpetrating these mass murders. Mass murder existed before the age of guns, but they were usually mass both in terms of the number of victims and in the number of killers. It was an exercise of kind of horrible community. Excuse me. In 1912, policing was much more haphazard and casual than today. There were authorities who sought, arrested, and tried criminals, but things like police being on duty all day, every day, was simply not a thing. The first thing people did when they wanted to solve a crime generally was call for bloodhounds. The scene was never preserved as it would be today. People were vaguely aware that it was a good idea to preserve crime scenes, but it wasn't a basic expectation. They didn't have police tape. People didn't know to back away and let them preserve the evidence. That was something that might happen for very rich and important people, where the best cops in the state are called in immediately. But for everyday things, not so much. Almost every crime scene that we discuss in The Man from the Train was disturbed by the neighbors walking through to take a look-see, especially if they discovered it in the first place. Some people attribute the mystery of Villisca to poor police work, but the marshal on duty actually did a well above average job. Quoting here again from The Man from the Train, Marshal Horton displayed immense courage by going through a dark house filled with dead bodies, holding a match in front of him for light, with no reason to believe that anything other than that the murderer was still in the house. He called the county sheriff, who was the only off-site police official available to him. He immediately called a private detective experienced in investigating homicides. He instructed the night watchman, his only assistants, to not let anyone into the house without a good reason. He sent immediately for bloodhounds and a fingerprint expert, and almost immediately called out the National Guard to establish a perimeter around the house, and met with people who had been through the house and made notes about what they had seen, and organized a volunteer search of all the outbuildings in the city. Within the first 36 hours, he canvassed the neighborhood to see what evidence the neighbors might have. He made notes about these conversations, which later proved to be vital in obstructing the prosecution of Frank Jones. What more could he have done? What other options did he have? Still, the situation left a lot of space for detectives who, pardon me, I'm right by the street, and sometimes people like to drive motorcycles very loudly right by. The situation left a lot of space for detectives who weren't exactly trained in crime solving. More often, they were like freelance private eyes. Some of them had very real skill. A detective from the Burns Agency recognized very early on that there were similarities between Villisca and the murders in Ellsworth, Kansas. Indeed, for the first couple of years, the private detectives did fairly diligent work that helped to preserve the facts of the case. But Just as often, private detectives were often unscrupulous people taking advantage of grief-stricken families and confused neighbors, as was the case with J.N. Wilkerson, another Burns Agency detective. Starting in 1914, Wilkerson worked with a crime reporter in Kansas City by the name of Boyle to prey upon and inflate the fears and prejudices held by townspeople against Frank Jones on the basis of his business rivalry, as well as J.B. Moore's dalliance with Jones's daughter-in-law. This pre-mortem gossip may have been true, but Frank Jones had nothing to do with it. Yet the Burns agencies had resources that the small town merchant did not. And when Jones pushed back against them, they came down on him with the force of a bunch of high-priced lawyers, endangering his freedom and his life. Wilkerson and Boyle delighted in taking ridiculous stories and escalating them instead of evaluating them on their merits and taking heightened emotions into account. Wilkerson even moved to Villisca full-time to host events where he laid out his case, which he called a dope sheet, against Jones. But you can only carry a frenzy like this so far before people start second-guessing, and eventually his bill came due. People started to notice the contradictions in Wilkerson's story, especially after he attempted to burglarize Jones's store. Soon after, the Burns Agency fired Wilkerson for another offense. Lynn Kelly, the Reverend who attended the service that the Moore and Stillinger family attended right before the murder, confessed again, as he had been doing on and off for several years, in 1917. And now that public opinion had turned in favor of Jones, Kelly was indicted. But Wilkerson, hoping to win another blow against Jones, faked evidence that Jones had basically faked evidence to convict Kelly. It's very convoluted. Kelly was acquitted, but Wilkerson, who was now one of the most recognizable figures in Villisca, decided to stick around, sleeping with other men's wives and running for office and trying to practice law. The state of Iowa had, at this point, shelled out for a professional state detective agency, in part because of the mess this had made. Eventually, these agents caught Wilkerson committing adultery. Literally, they listened outside his door for noises. I'm not making that up. And in 1918, he finally left Iowa for a very lucrative career, spreading conspiracy theories about the Lincoln assassination. But police work in 1912 wasn't only hunches, grudges, grubby neighbors, and bloodhounds, as it had often been for the previous 14 years of the man from the train's career as a murderer. Fingerprinting technology had arrived. Using fingerprints as identifiers dates back to the second millennium BCE, when Babylonians used fingerprints to sign documents. It was also present in Chinese forensic technologies dating back to 300 AD. In the West, the ridges upon our palms and fingers were first studied in the late 17th century. In the 1870s, a British officer named William Herschel, working in occupied India, used fingerprints to try to identify which pensions had been paid out to soldiers. Around the same time in Japan, a Scottish surgeon named Faulds noticed a fingerprint on a piece of pottery and began to study the whorls that you've probably heard about today. Faulds published his research first in Science, and Herschel was furious, falsely believing that his research had been stolen. The two began a slap fight for credit that would play out through letters to Nature and Science and other publications for the rest of their lives. A Croatian detective in Argentina named Juan Vucetich, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, took note of the debate and especially Francis Galton's work on the topic, and published his own research comparing fingerprint shapes, which is something that we still use today in identifying fingerprints. But no one took him seriously at first. Then the right case came along. Two children, Porciano and Felitza Rojas, were bludgeoned to death in 1899, and her mother and their mother, Francisca, claimed that she saw her ex, who had become a stalker, so she said, fleeing the scene. But this ex protested his innocence despite their interrogation techniques, which were pretty much torture. And it turned out that Francisca had a new lover who didn't care for the kids. Vucetich returned to the scene and found a fingerprint on the door. He sawed the part of the door with the fingerprint off and brought it back to the police station, where he asked Francisca if she had gone in to see her children's body before the police arrived. She said she had not, and he confronted her with the fingerprint, at which point she confessed to the murders. The man from the train was keeping up with all this. He knew about fingerprint technology. He read the papers. He had often wiped off his fingerprints, so they remained at the scene in Villisca and a few other places, just as they're left by criminals today who have seen CSI like everyone else. But small towns in Iowa didn't have access to that technology in theory. They were too busy getting hoodwinked by Wilkerson and hoping the bloodhounds would turn up a clue. Throughout the man from the train's period of activity, which is a polite way of putting bloody rampage, the challenge was not only making a connection between these similar cases in disparate towns. As his frequency increased, so basically before 1909, he was only committing murders, not that frequently, every few months at the most. And then he was dormant for a time in 1907 and 1908. And then in 1909, he came back basically with a vengeance, and started committing crimes much, much, much more frequently, a couple of weeks apart, sometimes 2 on the same night. And besides the fact that he was just committing them more frequently, wire networks like the Associated Press were also getting better connected, and it was easier to transmit stories across the nation without playing a giant game of telephone where all of the details get mixed up. There's one early on in 1904 in Florida where we still don't know the family's name. It's Kelly or Caffey or Smith. We're really not sure. But as you know, if you've read The Man from the Train all the way to the end, some people did know who he was and that he was capable of doing what he did. I don't want to spoil too much of the book, but we know what he looked like, how tall he was, where he had scars. Yet we couldn't find him because train travel allowed him to move quickly to a place where no one knew his face. This was another issue which scientists were attempting to solve with a standardized system like fingerprints, and what eventually gave rise to the fingerprinting system. In the late 19th century, French scientist Alphonse Bertillon set out to solve a problem. Authorities had no idea how to make a connection between a thief from Liverpool who was picked up and started picking pockets in London, because train travel allowed criminals to travel easily and escape identification for theft, assault, or worse. Bertillon began by essentially collaging different photographs to create composites of witness descriptions. Soon after, he got into minute measurements of people's head circumference, finger, leg, and arm lengths, and identifying moles. He also insisted on taking photographs of the subject, head on and in profile, the mugshot we still use today. His case was well proven in the case of the 1890s Paris anarchist Rava Scholl, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who was identified by a waiter when he was about to bomb a restaurant. A waiter noticed that he had a scar on his hand. This was also one of the ways that they tried to identify the man from the train in 1898 after his first crime. He was identified by a scar running from his wrist to his little finger, as well as his small, widely spaced teeth. But it was to no end. Though police departments from Canada to Chicago would send the North Brookfield Police Departments photographs of short, angry-looking men they arrested, it was never quite right. People did remember it for a few years, and there were reports of the man we believed to be this monster from 1898 through 1905. But by 1912, he was well forgotten. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm ready to take questions now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rachel. This is fascinating stuff. I'm wondering if you would share with us just for a moment about what it felt like that moment when you found the very first crime.
Oh boy. Well, so I'll tell you a little bit about how it's kind of all runs together in my mind. So it's easier for me to tell you kind of the story of how it goes. It's one of the things I pull out the most when I'm talking about this. So the first time my dad emailed me about this was about the first case of the man from the train, the first paragraph in Hurley, Virginia, the Bloody Penny. He sent it to me because I was living nearby. It was in Hurley, Virginia, which is a tiny mountain town. Um, it's so like deep in the mountains that like you can't see the sun after like 3 p.m. because the mountains are just so high on both sides. So he sent that to me, and at first I kind of ignored it, to be honest, because Dad has a habit of sending me a lot of stuff, and I don't always read it all that well. But then he kept working on the case, and my mom suggested that he hired me as a research assistant. So he contacted me, he sent me the Hurley murder, the first chapter, and this time I actually read it, and he gave me a little test. He asked me to try and find another murder based on that. So I Googled axe murder, and Villisca popped right up, proving that I could see the connection and that, he wasn't just saying things here, that there actually was a connection. About a month after that, I moved from Roanoke back to Kansas, where I live today. I live like a block from him, in his old former office, actually, which is right next to the train tracks. And so I started researching on my own. He wanted me at first to look at 1907 and 1908, which, as I mentioned, was kind of a dead period. I didn't find anything at first. There's nothing to be found there as far as we know. And in fact, I'm hoping that I can talk to you guys soon about some new research that might show where he was during that time, but that's for later. But anyway, so I had just moved back to Kansas and I needed a job, so I wanted to keep looking. So I pushed back to 1906, 1905, 1904, and I started finding a lot of murders. I found the Southern murders pretty quickly. So right away, in which people were lynched, one of the most horrible stories, I think, in the entire book. So we knew that there were a lot more to find, and I had to start going about it more methodically. About a month after that, my husband went to a show. He goes to a lot of concerts, and for the first year that I told this story, I remembered him. I was like, oh, my husband went to a hardcore metal show. He loves metal. He didn't go to a metal show. He went to a Jackson 5 cover band. But he left me at home. We just moved. The train was rolling by. It was super creepy. And I was looking at a murder in Maine. And at the end, it said, this is surely the same fiend who killed the Newton family in North Brookfield, Massachusetts, a year ago. So I Googled it, and I came up with this history of the Worcester Police Department from 1600 to 1904. And that had a mention of the case. And I read through it, and at the end it said, this is surely, spoilers guys, this is surely the work of the farmhand Paul Mueller, who was seen at 11:30 at night, headed for the train. And right away I was like, we have a name? Is this real? Am I finding this? Is this actual? And I emailed my dad, and he didn't email me back right away. So I started calling him over and over again and emailing him again and again, until he finally, and just kept researching and finding out more and more about this case that lined up with Villisca, the covered windows, the back of the axe, the lamp being moved. It was really overwhelming to see that that night. And that night he emailed me back eventually at like 2:30. He was in Boston then, and he said, well, I don't know if I believe you, but we've got a story now. We know where we can end this.
Yes. Oh, it looks like we're getting some questions from the audience. I see Mike wants to know where the man was from originally and how many murders you think he committed.
The man was from Germany. He was a German soldier. That's about what we know about his background. He was about 35 in 1898, so he would have been roughly 50 at the time the Villisca axe murders were committed. So we don't know a ton more about him, unfortunately. He might have been Austrian, but definitely German or Austrian. He had a strong accent. He had a sailor's gait. He had a lot of carpentry skills. That was one of the things that set him apart, that he was well known for in Massachusetts.
Excellent. And then we've got another question that says, would you say they're crimes of murder or murder and theft or just murder?
He was pretty particular about just murdering, and in fact, sometimes would leave money at the scene to show that he wasn't murdering. Basically, he wasn't doing this for thievery reasons, basically. But a lot of times they assume that it was about murder. In fact, the first headline about the first case says killed for $40. But he would leave valuables at the scene all the time. I would guess that he did commit theft sometimes, but I think it was separate from his murdering.
And that was definitely one of the features in the book that you mentioned that struck me as just so strange, to have a man break in and leave money on the mantelpiece of the people he's murdered. It definitely seems like he must be reading the press coverage.
I think definitely he wanted people to know that he was not in need of money, or that's not why he did it.
Absolutely. So we've got a question from Michelle. What were police forensics like at the time? And I'm wondering if I can tie that to another question as well. Would you say that this sort of crime, this sort of spree that the man from the train was on, would it be possible to do that in today's day and age? Or do forensics prevent that?
So police forensics really varied. In the big cities, they knew what fingerprinting was. And if a case caught a lot of attention, sometimes fingerprinting would come into play. But forensics was mostly just common logic, to be honest. It was not super organized. It wasn't like there wasn't fingerprint tape or fingerprint dust or anything like that. There certainly wasn't DNA. In fact, in one of the other cases in New Orleans, or not New Orleans, but Louisiana, there was a whole day in court devoted to whether or not someone's pants were stained with blood or just red paint. Like, they couldn't tell the difference between paint and blood. They were not sophisticated. And a lot of times there would be questions about, like, is this animal blood or is this people blood? Couldn't really tell that either. So it was very rudimentary. It was very not very complicated, not very advanced at all. I'm sorry, Jenny, you had a question. I've kind of blanked on.
Oh, and would you say this sort of crime spree, that number of crimes would be possible?
I mean, in terms of being able to kill a lot of people, yeah, absolutely you could. I mean, guns allow you to kill as many people as he killed in his whole career. I saw Mike asked a question, how many murders do you think he committed altogether? The ones that we're really confident about in The Man from the Train, there's, I think, there's 50 different events, but of the ones we're relatively confident about, it totals roughly 100. And I would guess he killed more than that. I would guess that there are ones that we haven't identified, that we haven't identified yet, that somebody will at some point in the future. But to answer your question, Carrie, about whether or not people could get away with this today, I mean, I don't know if you could jump the trains so easily, but I mean, And car travel is, of course, less anonymous. So it would be much more difficult. But at the same time, I think that if you targeted the right victims, then their deaths might go unnoticed for longer. People aren't as in each other's business as they were 100 years ago. Well, in one way, digitally, we're much more in each other's business. We're much more intimate with each other in a lot of ways. But your neighbor wasn't talking to you. It doesn't talk to you every day the way that they did 100 years ago. You know, they saw the moors every day. A lot of people, they knew how they took care of their cows. And if they heard the cows mooing really loudly and they knew they were, then they knew they weren't being cared for and they had to go check on them.
Sure. Well, now it looks like we're getting a couple of questions about some of the other defining characteristics of the murders that helped us tie them together. Things like, did he use an axe or item at the site or bring his own, and were there sexual aspects to the murder? Could you briefly cover a few of those defining characteristics that helped you pin them to the man on the train?
Absolutely. So he never brought his own axe. He always picked up an axe from a neighboring woodpile. This was something that most small towns, less so in big cities, but in small towns, pretty much everyone had an axe at the ready somewhere. But one of the big things we were looking for is the back of the axe. So he always used the back of the axe, never the blade of the axe. I should have brought my own axe in here so I could demonstrate on you, so I could show you what I mean. But so if you use the sharp side of the axe, it can get stuck. If you've ever chopped wood, you'll know this. It can get stuck and you have to like jerk it out of there, which can be a problem when you're dealing with low ceilings. The blunt side, though, is much more effective, especially if you want to kill people before they wake up. That way you don't alert everybody else to what's going on at the scene. Yes, there was a sexual element to his crimes. Newspapers in 1912 used a lot of euphemisms about it. They were, as I said, pretty prurient in a lot of ways, but they would make reference to substances being found at the scene, semen basically. That's very well documented in the Villisca case. And we believe that that was a big part of his motivation, was being able to perv out on the bodies of little girls, basically. He always chose families with victims, he always chose families with little girls. So that was a big part of his motivation. And there is a lot of evidence that he would spend time masturbating at the scene afterwards.
Certainly. And in your writing, you identify almost 3 distinct periods of his spree. You know, the first killing, he's still figuring it out, it seems. But by the end, he's got it down. Can you speak a little bit to some of how he progressed?
Sure, yeah. So the first crime is often distinct from other crimes for a lot of reasons. First of all, they usually choose someone they know rather than a random person. So that was one thing that distinguished it from his other crimes, was that he knew the family. People knew who he was. People knew his association with the family. So that was a big thing. Another thing was, so I talked a little bit about before 1907 and after 1907, his crimes were very different. A big thing was that before 1907, he set houses on fire almost every time to cover up his crimes and to make sure that no one was left behind. And one of the things that connected us to him with the first one is that he tried to set the house on fire, but did not successfully do it. He threw a lamp at a wood pile, basically, but for whatever reason, it didn't catch flame. So that was one thing that he learned from that first crime, that he didn't make a mistake on again for years and years. And he continued setting fires until the Hood family in Beckley, West Virginia in 1910, at which point he stopped. Earlier on, he was much more likely to hike a couple of miles from the train to seek out a family. It was less likely to be in an established town and much more likely to be kind of out on a country road. And at some point, he stopped doing that right around the 1909 Beckley case. So my thing, what I guess is that he almost got caught at some point when he set something on fire. When you set something on fire, it attracts a lot of attention, a lot of emergency. So I think that he almost got caught setting a fire and then stopped. And I think he also realized that cities could be more attractive than he thought because it was so easy to slip in and slip back out. So I think that he was walking around the cities more often and kind of prospecting, looking for where he would be later. So I think he was stalking a little bit more later. So that was definitely one of the things. Yeah.
Absolutely. So Amanda's asking, did he ever go back to the same place more than once?
No, he never. He attacked twice in one night in Colorado. You can actually go and see that. I've been to see it in Colorado Springs. The house still stands. If you go and look for it, someone will be like, "Are you looking for the murder house?" They will show you right where it was. So there were two events that night. And I do think he would kind of go through the same regions maybe, but definitely not the same place twice. So yeah.
Absolutely. Oh, someone is thinking about touring the murder house. If they tour the house, do you have any insights on what they should look for?
I've never gotten that question before. So I don't want to say I don't believe in ghosts. I've always said that I'm not on a ghost wavelength, so that's never been an element of this for me. So in terms of ghosts, I can't speak to anything. Let's see. What would I say about the Villisca house? One thing that I always think about when I go through these old houses, that this has changed for me, is I think about how quickly he would have had to go up the stairs to get up quickly enough that nobody knew what was going on, like how efficient he must have been like that. Jenny, I think you asked about that. And that was another element of why he transitioned from countryside to in-town locations, was that he'd just gotten so much better at it and so much quicker at it.
Sure.
So that's one thing that I would think about with that. Let's see, what would I be interested to know about it? I would look at the windows and think about like what it was, how he shut them up and how he blockaded them. Yeah, that's one thing I would think about. Another thing I like to think about with these houses, and this is, when I'm walking around historic neighborhoods, old houses that were built from that era, I always think about it when I see kids' toys in the front yard. I think that's a big thing that he was looking for, was signs of children. So when you imagine the house, imagine, little toys outside, signs of children, probably like a toy on a string or something like that back in the day. So that's one thing I would say.
Absolutely. Oh, so Mike is curious about the friends of the Moore children that were staying the night. So we had Ina and Lena Stillinger who were there with them that night. He's wondering if there is anything interesting about this aspect. I'm curious because, as you said, he seems to have selected his victims somewhat carefully. Everybody had an axe, but not everybody had young children in the house.
Yes. Some people, I think that he didn't choose whether or not to visit a house based on whether they had an axe. Just as often he'd pick up an axe from a neighbor's yard. So that's one thing. Let me look through real So they lived outside of town, and so they would have had a trip back, and they were supposed to stay with their grandmother that night. But I think they were good friends with the girls. What were the girls' names? Pardon me.
Oh, you're all good. I think I've got the names of the Stillinger girls. I do not have the names of the Moore girls, which is interesting.
I feel like one of their names is Ruby, but I might be thinking of the Cassaways. Oh, here we go. They were friends of Catherine Moore.
Yes.
5 to 11. Yeah, we don't have a ton of details about that. I would definitely check out the Rundles documentary, Villisca Living with a Mystery. It's very good. It's what Dad saw, I think, in the first place in like 2008, that got him started on this journey. So yeah, I would definitely recommend that. That's got a ton of details about the daughters for sure.
Oh, and I think Melissa has finished the book because she is asking about some of what's suggested in the, shall we say, epilogue. She's asking, can you talk about, and that word I am not positive how to pronounce. Thank you. Do you think he returned to Germany after his killing spree?
So Hinterkaifeck is a famous German case. It was a remote village in which a family, very weird family. There was an incest involved, really kind of not well respected within the town, in which they were found in their beds, murdered with the back of an axe. You know, when I was a little kid, I used to take German lessons and I never took them seriously. And it has really bit me in the butt as an adult because anytime I have any true crime research, it always goes back to Germany. It's always stuff like, well, if I knew German, I could understand a lot more about this. My new book, Whack Job, is the first chapter is about a basically Neanderthal murder from 450,000 years ago. And there's this weird German rule called the hat brim line rule that plays into this. Basically, sorry, I'm going off topic, but I hope you will indulge me. Basically, imagine a hat.
Mm-hmm.
If an injury, if you're evaluating a skull and trying to figure out whether or not a fracture in the skull is an indication of a murder, if it's above the hat brim line, it probably is a murder, but if it's below, it's probably a fall. So that was one of the things that they were looking at in this 500,000-year-old murder case, basically. And that is also very German. And that's one of those things that I wish I spoke German, because I really would like to know. I really hope that it gets translated into German at some point, because I would love for German Reddit to take a look at that and see what they can find. I'm about 50% on Hinterkaifeck. It's not one of the ones that I'm solid about. It's one of the ones, what I consider a low information event, where it could be there, it could not be there. I want to let people know so that they can continue their own research and come to their own conclusions, but it's not something I'm set on one way or another.
It's a fascinating possible connection, for sure. Anytime you can take two well-known unsolved cases and tie them together, there's definitely a level of interest there that I think
it is. And all of the rest of, I mean, except for Villisca, pretty much all of these have been forgotten, except for to a certain extent, the Clementine Barnabette related cases, which are a whole other thing there. related, but not kind of the same thing where it's a low information event and they are not exactly related. But, most of these crimes, the Newtons, Cassaways, Schmidt, Schultz's, they were completely forgotten. So it's good to connect it to some ones that other people have well researched.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, we'll go ahead and have one more real quick question.
I'm good on time. I can answer some
Perfect. So Michelle's asking a little bit about what it's like collaborating with your dad, and I'm very curious as well. For this story, you had that unique challenge of you're researching for yourself, but also for someone else, and then you're translating your information into someone else's voice. And you've mentioned your book Whack Job, which will be a book told in your voice. So what is that challenge like? Are there things you gain from writing in someone else's voice, and are there things you're looking forward to with writing your own?
Well, I'm gonna go answer what it was like working with my dad, and I'll talk about voice stuff. It was really good, actually. I thought it was. My dad can be a bit difficult. If you follow him on Twitter, you know that he can really pop off. And so I was worried at first that it was going to be constant fights like when I was a teenager. But it really wasn't. Dad has always had a lot of respect for what I had to say about the case and has always really listened to me. And he's always taken my ideas seriously. In a lot of different situations, you think about if someone's research assistant came up with this, would they just take it and run? And I never really had to worry about that with Dad. We have a lot of trust. So we knew from pretty early on it was going to be a co-author gig. And I was able to trust that and look forward to that, even though it was also kind of nerve-wracking because, I found the first crime in 2013 and this couldn't come out till 2017. So every day I would get up and worry like, oh no, what if BuzzFeed figured it out before I did? Which they didn't, thankfully. But it was really good overall. It's actually been really good for our relationship. We've always got something to talk about. We've always got something to debate with a lot of mutual respect. And, when your dad is your boss, there's a lot of weird power dynamics there. But considering that, I mean, Dad knows murder a lot better than I do. He's always been obsessed with murder and baseball. So I had a certain amount of, respect for all the research he'd done in his 60 years before he started writing this book. And also, I knew he was the boss and I knew it was his word. And I knew also that, most writers don't get an opportunity with their first book to get this kind of platform. So I was grateful for that. So it was really a good process, a smooth process. And yeah, it was interesting dipping into Dad's voice. While I was writing this, I was trying to closely imitate his voice, but of course you can never do it 100%. But it's funny because, I've had people say that this last chapter with Brookfield, the first crime, they can definitely tell like, oh, it completely changes, the tone of voice changes. But there's a lot of little places where I'll look through it and I'll say, that sounds like Dad, but that's actually me. I remember writing that. But at the same time, and it was also good for my first book to have kind of a set of training wheels on. In a lot of ways, it was good to go through the process of promoting and editing and publishing with not all of the responsibility being on me, with people looking to Dad for decisions, which was frustrating frequently, but also it was good to not have it all weigh on me. And sometimes that's really difficult with a new book. When I'm trying to write in my dad's voice, there is a model I can look to, but when I'm writing in my own voice, it's like, okay, well, I have to make all these decisions now, and I don't always want to make them. It's a lot of responsibility. So I hope that answers your question, Jenny.
Absolutely. Oh, Allison has a follow-up. She says, which cases do you and your father disagree on the most?
Let's see. Stetka is an interesting one. Stetka is up in New Brunswick in Canada. And it's funny because the first time I wrote to him about it, I was like, I don't really think this is one of them. It doesn't make sense to me. And he wrote back like, oh, this is totally it. This is, blah, blah, blah. This is, there's the fire, there's the axe. It's definitely 100% one of his cases. But by the time we got to publication, I had turned around to where I think it's a definite man from the train case, and he's less confident about it. And that's partially just instinct. There's this detail about a dog barking at the Stetka house. And there are several little cases where the dog survives for some reason. He never kills the dog.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's weird. And that always just connects, kind of seals it for me. I think, though, we're really pretty much on the same page about most of these. We don't have any huge disagreements where I'm sure that one case is in and he refuses to acknowledge it. We've basically, if there was one case that I insisted was related, we would have included it. And of course, Dad got his way anyway. So anything he wanted to include was included anyway. But yeah, mostly we were on the same page, I would say.
Fantastic. Well, it is a fantastic book. And I think you shared with me earlier that there are a few new developments. If people here would like to hear more about them, what do they need to know?
So my dad and I both are going to be giving a speech in person at Iowa State University in October. Iowa State's the one in Ames, right?
Yes.
Good. Okay. I want to make sure I wasn't messing it up. Yes, Iowa State University, Ames, October 27th. There are some really exciting new research, not from us, from somebody who just emailed in, has found some really cool stuff that really answers a few lingering questions about it. So put that on your calendar, October 27th. We will both be there. And I hope you come see us.
Fabulous. Good chance to get maybe our book signed too, if we're so inclined. Wonderful. Well, Rachel McCarthy James, thank you so much for joining us today, for sharing your insights and sharing this book. For anyone who has joined us a little bit late, remember the name of the book is The Man from the Train. It's available from the Des Moines Public Library. I'm going to toss a quick link in the chat. Feel free to click on it, place a hold, or you can check it out via Overdrive if ebooks are your thing. And don't forget, coming in 2023, Whack Job, another book about axe murder by Rachel McCarthy James. Thank you guys so much for coming. Thank you, Rachel, so much for sharing.
Thank you for having me. This was terrific. I really enjoyed it.